So if you don't mind, we might start off praying. Some of you, that'll be a custom, some of you not. If you don't want to pray, that's okay. Almighty God, thank you for the freedom to be here tonight. Thank you for the luxuries of tea and coffee and air conditioning. Thank you so much for the peace. Thank you for the peace you give us through your forgiveness. Oh, thank you, Jesus. Thank you want us to love you with all our hearts and all our minds, all our soul and all our strength. Help us to all love you more. Amen. Thank you all very much for coming. So as some of you might have seen, this seriously is one of a series. It's called Back in Black because all the topics are very black. They're all very dark. So crusades and apartheid and slavery, it's all dark stuff. So Back in Black. If you know the AC/DC, we should be playing some of their tracks in the back. Yeah. Yes, exactly. 50% of us will love it, and so yeah. I'll introduce Miles. So Miles is speaking at Seriously for the first time this year. A little bit of a background: he's got a PhD in political science. He's helping to defend our country in a few days' time, working with the Defence Force in his capacity as a political scientist, and so Miles. He's been a friend of mine, and I value his friendship greatly, which is why he's leaving and going to Adelaide in about 48 hours' time. So the fact that Miles is here when he should be madly packing is a real gift. Yeah. Very good. Excellent. At the end of each talk, we'll have a Q&A. It is a Q&A. It's not a time for comments. If at the end of a speaker's presentation you want to have a comment, then just grab the speaker privately and make a comment, but otherwise just reserve your Q&A time to questions. And do share it. If you said your question, then leave it at that, and we'll leave it for somebody else to have another question. And I'll hand it over to Miles. Yeah.
Thank you for that, John. Yes, my name is Miles. I suppose that given that John said I'll soon be working for the Defense Department, I suppose I should probably say that the comments here tonight do not reflect the views of the Commonwealth Government, the Defense Department, or the Defense Science and Technology Group, but they are wholly my own as a private individual. I would just like to make one comment before I get into it. Though I will be leaving Bridgie here in the next couple of days, I've greatly enjoyed my time here. It's a wonderful place, and I really thank God that He directed me here. It's been really good. So, yeah, thank you all. Okay. Just excuse me a moment while I just make sure that I'm getting this. Okay, that's moving forward. That's going back. Okay, we have established that the clicker is easy to use. Always good. Okay, so the presentation for tonight is, did the teachings of the Bible have a major impact on the anti-slavery movement in Britain? So to begin with, let's just create a little bit of an outline as to what we're going to go over tonight. As you can see, we're going to look at the biblical context of in relation to slavery. Then we're going to jump into the history of British abolitionism, and then we will wrap it up with just a bit of a conclusion. So, jumping into the biblical context, there are a few things which the Bible says about slavery. In particular, the New Testament was a major motivator for those who opposed slavery. If we take a look at 1 Timothy, chapter 1, verse 8 to 11, it reads, "We know that the law is good if one uses it properly. We also know that the law is made not for the righteous, but for lawbreakers and rebels, the ungodly and sinful, the unholy and irreligious, and for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers, for the sexually immoral, for those practicing homosexuality, for slave traders and liars and perjurers, and for whatever else is contrary to the sound doctrine. That conforms to the gospel concerning the glory of the blessed God, which He entrusted to me." So, what we have here in this verse is essentially a passage in which God, through His law, is seeking to undermine the slave trade. Okay, so it's included in there amongst other things, but slave trade is definitely one of them. So if we advance on, we see that in 1 Timothy chapter 6, 1-2, it reads, "All who are under the yoke as slaves are to regard their own masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and our doctrine will not be spoken against. Those who have believers as their masters must not be disrespectful to them because they are brethren, but must serve them all the more because those who partake of the benefit are believers and beloved. Teach and preach these principles." So from this passage, it becomes pretty clear that masters and slaves should regard each other as brothers. Moving on to the next passage, we see in Colossians chapter 4, verse 1, it reads, "Masters, grant to your slaves justice and fairness, knowing that you too have a master in heaven." So, in a sense, even worldly masters are also slaves to our ultimate divine master in heaven. So, moving on to the next passage, in Galatians chapter 3, verses 26-29, it reads, "For you are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free man, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's descendants, heirs according to promise." So from this passage, it becomes pretty clear that masters have the same status before God as their slaves. So moving on to the fifth of 7, this presentation is not just passages, it's leading somewhere, and we're almost there. In 1 Corinthians 7:21, it reads, "Were you called while a slave? Do not worry about it. But if you are able also to become free, rather do that." So this verse is pretty clear that if you are a slave and can become free, then you should do so. Moving on to 1 Corinthians 7:22, it reads, "For he who has called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who was called while free is Christ's slave." So from this, it's pretty clear that those persons who are not slaves themselves are, in a sense, also slaves, thus creating this sense of unity between those who are slaves and those who are not slaves. And moving on to the last passage that we'll discuss in this section, we have Matthew 7:12, which reads, "So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets." So from this, it's pretty clear that Jesus was saying that we should treat others in the same way that we wish to be treated. So what do all of these passages mean? Well, for one thing, it means that I am now a pastor here at the church. But no, more seriously though, it means that if we put it in the greater context of the Bible story of the creation, the fall of man, and then our redemption through Jesus, it means that everyone, all humans, are equal before God. And that means that God grants each individual liberty, and that we, as fellow individuals, should not infringe upon the liberty of others. Okay? That's in a very, very much a nutshell what's being said there. So this creates the biblical context for the emergence of the abolitionist movement. So we'll go ahead and proceed to part 2, which is the history of British abolitionism. Now, it raises the issue, why are we looking at the British? Well, the British, in many ways, were the forerunners. Slavery has existed in many places all around the world, but when we look at a concerted effort to end slavery, the first place that it really got going was in Britain. But when we look at the British abolitionist movement, it's characterized by a few things. One is that it interacts with secular, worldly, social elements. It's not a case of you have Christian abolitionists acting and it just leads to abolitionists. They have to act within a complex social system composed of many actors who are not Christian themselves. And that leads to a complication of the story. So one reason we're going to look at the British abolitionist movement tonight is to really emphasize the core importance of the Bible and its teachings to the British abolitionist movement and how it was the motivator and sustainer for that movement. The other thing that needs to be acknowledged before we get too far into the history, that the abolitionist movement was a story of progress marked by stalemate. There were times where they were able to move the dial on the issue, but then there were other times where the movement just did not progress at all. So it was very much stoppy-starty. And a lot of those stops, those stalemates, were as a result of changes in the social context in which they were operating. But despite those periods of stalemate, what you did have was a gradual expansion of the anti-slavery attitude and action throughout Britain and eventually the wider world. And what makes the British abolitionist movement among Christians was that, and this is often not acknowledged, is that it was the world's first true lobby movement for human rights. So when we look at the news today and when we read stories about human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, all of these organizations, the British Christian abolitionists were their forerunner. So this is square one on the human rights movement that a lot of us are very familiar with and to some extent take for granted today. So now that we have the context in which the British abolitionist movement got going, why did it come about? What we have here is the triangle trade. Beginning in the late 1500s and then growing in the 1600s and reaching its zenith in the 1700s, we had the emergence of what historians and contemporaries at the time refer to as the triangle trade. You had ships from Britain sailing down to Africa with manufactured goods, selling them to the Africans for slaves, who would then import them to the New World, the West Indies, the Caribbeans, North and South America, to work on various plantations, who in turn would create mostly agricultural goods, so sugar, cotton, coffee, these sorts of things, and then they would be imported back to Britain. It's this trade, this maritime sea trade, the triangle trade, that sustained slavery for approximately a 200-year period. And it grew. The numbers which were transported from Africa to the New World is easily in the millions, possibly in the tens of millions. It's difficult because to pinpoint exact numbers, because though traders did tend to keep records, they also tended to fudge them. And then also just the inaccuracies of historical records on ships from such a long time ago. But it's easy to say that the human misery that came from this triangle trade is immense, and it's very hard to find a period of human suffering of equal or greater measure. Now, with slavery in particular in the British context, the British were very much into the slave trade. What you see here on the screen are some clan crests. The Scots are famous for their clans, and those clans have crests, and a number of them were very active in the slave trade. So much so that they made so much money that they put images of black African slaves into their clan crests. This is I think a pretty powerful image which shows the extent to which British society and its economy had come to rely on African slavery. You don't put things into your family crest if you don't think it's really important. And the fact that they were putting African slaves into their family crest shows you how important they thought it was to their society and their livelihood. Now, it just wasn't money which was sustaining this trade. As this trade emerged, you also had authors who spoke into the situation. Among them, you had famous political commentators and theorists such as the Englishman David Hume and the Frenchman Voltaire, who asserted racial differences. They were essentially apologists for the slave trade. The argument basically ran that Africans were inferior or were subhuman in some way. Therefore, they were essentially best suited to being slaves, to being hard labor, manual labor. That's all they were really there for. So the argument went, we, as Europeans, because they were European and speaking to Europeans, we should go out and grab them and make them slaves, and we should get benefit from doing so. So you had a social impact, you had an economic factor, and you had now the emergence of an ideology which supported slavery. Now, it took a while, but eventually Christians started to think about this, and they started to think that this probably wasn't a really good thing. Now, in the British context, the first group to really speak on this issue were the Quakers. The Quakers in 1727, they came out with their first doctrinal statement on the issue, and they were opposed to slavery. And for the most part, no one really listened. A lot of this had to do with, first of all, Quakers were a very small sect within the wider British society, and also because they were nonconformists, meaning that they were not members of the Church of England, they were actually barred from entering Parliament. So no one really listened, and they couldn't access the halls of power. But they did start, they got the ball rolling. So that's 1727. Now, as things started to get going, these African slaves here, they slowly started to trickle into Britain. The triangle trade, which was sending black Africans to the New World as slaves, were slowly starting to trickle into Britain. Now, this was partly a case of as merchants went to the New World and had their slaves, they go back to Britain for business, and they take their slaves with them. Or it was a case of you were a wealthy Briton and you didn't want to do something and you weren't willing to pay somebody to be your servant. when you could just go and get a slave and then not have to pay them ever again. So you'd pay somebody to bring a slave in, and then you had a slave. But all of this was being done under a legal cloud. Could Britons have slavery in Britain? No one knew. So you had some people who were Christians who were opposed to slavery deciding, we got to get involved in this, and we got to get involved in it in a legal sense. Thus enters Granville Sharp. Granville Sharp was an Anglican minister. He was an evangelical, and he was very much against the slave trade. He was so against the slave trade that he decided to also become a lawyer. And he spent much of his time traveling around Britain, interacting with these new slaves who were coming into Britain, and then taking up the legal challenge, saying, hey, you don't need to be a slave. Let's go to court, and the court will decide that you are not a slave because slavery does not exist in Britain. Granville Sharp did this for quite a while. But sometimes the court cases came down against him on technicalities. Sometimes the issue was resolved because one of the parties to the matter died, or they settled out of court. But he still kept going. And still, the legal cloud remained. Until 1772, the year that really got the ball rolling on abolitionism. Because in that year, Granville Sharp got his opportunity. And it came down to somebody that history has largely forgotten, unless you're a lawyer, but whose impact is pretty profound. A slave by the name of, who came to be known as Somerset, was a West African who was enslaved and sent to Virginia. When he was there, he was bought by an English citizen named Charles Stuart. Charles Stuart was a merchant who traveled back to Britain and took Somerset with him as his slave. While in Britain, Somerset had enough time to attend churches and interact with local Christian groups. He befriended a small group of Christians, and he converted, was baptized, and had 3 baptismal godparents, which is something that was quite common in Britain at that time, having baptismal godparents. Now, Somerset decided that given that he was now a Christian and that he was free of his sins in the eyes of God, that he should also be free in a worldly sense. So he took the only legal course that was open to him at the time, and he ran away. Well, Stuart, his slave master, wasn't too happy about this, so he went and he tracked him down. And he grabbed him, and he took him to the port to be loaded onto a ship to be taken to Jamaica so he could make some money from selling his troublesome slave to Jamaicans, and he'd work the rest of his probably short life on a sugar plantation field. Well, fortunate for Somerset, his 3 baptismal godparents weren't going to put up with this, and they went to court. And under a writ of habeas corpus, which means show me the body, which is essentially the person in question must be produced to a court, they were able to get Somerset brought before the court. And this is where we have Lord Mansfield enter. Lord Mansfield was the Lord Chief Justice of England. He sat on the king's bench. He was numero uno court judge bigwig. And he did not want to deal with slavery at all. Remember Granville Sharp? He was running around trying to get slavery overturned in the courts. Well, Lord Mansfield was running around after him trying to squash the issue, because Lord Mansfield didn't want to deal with the repercussions that would fall out from it. But unfortunately, the Somerset v. Stuart case ended up in his lap, and Stuart was unwilling to budge. Somerset wanted his freedom. Stuart wanted the slave to be his slave. And so Mansfield had to deal with the issue. Now, this had become quite a particular issue, because in the court proceedings, Stuart's solicitor said that Mansfield had to confirm that slavery was legal in Britain because the 12 to 15,000 slaves in England needed to have legal certainty that they were in fact slaves. But Mansfield, being backed into a corner, neither party was withdrawing the matter, neither party was dying. He was going to have to make a decision, and so he decided that upon the basis of natural law and common law, natural law being law which is natural as imbued from God, common law being the law which is established by the courts, that there was no basis for slavery. It could only be through positive law, which means an act of parliament, that could establish slavery in Britain. As such a law did not exist, therefore slavery could not be enforced in Britain. As a result, Somerset went free because his 3 baptismal godparents and Granville Sharp had kept the matter going, and Lord Mansfield was backed into a corner and he had to make a decision. Well, now that Mansfield had decided that slavery was not legal in Britain and could not be enforced, slavery largely evaporated overnight because slave owners had no legal recourse to keep their slaves as slaves. The ball had gotten going. But as so often happens, we have events. The first major distraction in the abolitionist movement was the American War of Independence, much of which was partly due to the result of the Somerset case. Though we are quite familiar in popular culture with the Boston Tea Party and the issues in New England that sparked the conflict, the main motivator for the Southern American colonies was the Somerset case. If England had freed its slaves, then what would stop the mother country from freeing slaves in the Southern American colonies? But as so often happens in war, much of the other issues of the day are suspended during the crisis. So as a result, you didn't really see a whole lot of movement on the issue of abolitionism for the next roughly 10 years. But things were still going on, and one of them was Amazing Grace. In 1779, you had the hymn Amazing Grace. Now, how many of you here have heard of Amazing Grace? Yes, I'm sure a lot of you have. How many of you know that it was directly as a result of the slave trade? Oh, okay, so a few people. Okay, that's good. No, that's good. The hymn, Amazing Grace, was written by John Newton. And John Newton was a slave captain for approximately 20 years, and then he realized that this isn't a good thing. God didn't want him to do it. He repented, and he became an Anglican minister and eventually led to the song Amazing Grace. And it's been pretty popular since, but in the day, it was the thing to sing. Top of the charts, as it were. But the American Revolution or War of Independence was still going on at this time. It was getting to its later years, but it effectively wound up with the Siege of Yorktown in 1781, which meant that the crisis which dominated public opinion and discussion wrapped up pretty much just in time for the Zong Massacre. Now, the Zong Massacre was a pretty horrible event. What you had was a ship named Zong, and it was transporting slaves from West Africa to the Caribbean. Well, in transit, things got a bit difficult. So in order to cut costs, the ship's captain decided that the 130 slaves he had on board needed to be thrown off. So 130 people were just thrown into the sea because the balance sheet required it. But not wanting to stop there, he decided that because he had to expend the cost of getting rid of his merchandise, he could put in an insurance claim. This led to the case of Gregson v. Gilbert in 1783. And the reason it led to this was because the insurance company, Gilbert, decided, we're not going to give you an insurance payout on this. You threw these slaves overboard when you didn't need to. Now, up here on the screen, you'll see some interesting photos. Now, the Zong Massacre is touched upon in the movie Belle. And Belle is about the woman in the painting, the darker-skinned woman in the painting, because both of these women were the great nieces of Lord Mansfield. Remember Lord Mansfield from the Somerset case? He also took on Gregson v. Gilbert. Now, the reason that this is interesting is that Mansfield he didn't have children himself, but he had great nieces. And one of his great nieces was named Dido. And Dido, her mother, had been a slave. Okay? So he had mixed race relations. Now, most historians think that his decision-making did not flow on from his familial relations, but it is important to know that to some extent it might have, we don't know, you really have to get deep down into it. But I bring this up because it's a pretty good movie and I highly recommend you go and check it out. But going back to the Gregson v. Gilbert matter, the reason why that this was such an important thing was that Mansfield decided that Gregson, the ship owners, had thrown the slaves overboard when there was no need to. That the ship did not need to go out and throw them overboard, that they could have stopped in at port at various stages along the way. Now, what this means is that Mansfield gave an implicit recognition to the value of the slave, and that masters had some degree of responsibility towards that slave. Okay? If you think about it, if you go out into the sea and you just throw like pencils or pens overboard, right? Okay, it's a waste of pencils or pens, but that's your right. You can do that. What obligation do you have to such an inanimate object? But if you go out to sea and say maybe you throw a pet overboard, well, there's animal rights, there's some degree of responsibility there, okay? So it's sort of almost in line with what Mansfield's saying. There's some degree of responsibility of masters towards slaves. That was a pretty big thing. And what the Zong Massacre really did was that it galvanized public opinion, because you now had a legal decision which moved the dial even further on the abolitionist movement, and you have a public which is outraged that something could happen. So in 1783, you had a Quaker-led petition to Parliament to end the slave trade. This was the first time it had really been done. People had spoken out against slavery, but it wasn't until 1783 that someone bothered to actually put together a petition. And petitions are hard to do. I mean, they're hard to do now, but they were really hard to do back then. Travel was a lot harder. And then also those people who are actually eligible to sign a petition to Parliament is hard as well. Because to sign a petition means that you're a legal voter, and this was in the days where very few people had the vote. But what did happen was that you had 300 signatures. Okay, well, 300 signatures is better than no signatures, right? So it started. But what you had, and this is reflected in this really good movie here, Amazing Grace, is that you had the beginnings of the efforts. And this is another movie I highly recommend if you haven't seen it. So we have the Zong Massacre, and we have the courts starting to get involved in the slave trade, political movements getting going with petitions. It's starting to get going. So then, in 1787, we have the emergence of the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. It's also sometimes called the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. Both titles seem to be interdependent. But this was another small group of people. Again, it was dominated by Quakers. You had 9 Quakers and 3 Anglicans. But among those 3, you had Granville Sharp. Remember him from the Somerset case? And you also had a new character, Thomas Clarkson. We'll be hearing more from him later. So this society was now going out and really ginning up opposition to the slave trade. And this was done through public speeches, writing in early newspapers, society meetings that people could attend. And one of the things that people did was they got pretty fashionable. You had Josiah Wedgwood, and he created this medallion. Now, if you can see there, I don't know if you can see it, but it says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Yeah. Remember those biblical passages I read at the start, speaking about the brotherhood of humanity? That's really coming through in this medallion. This was a huge fashion thing. People would wear them all the time. They'd wear them as necklaces. Women would put them on their dresses, all sorts of things. So it got around. One of the members of the society who also spoke was a man named Olaudah Equiano. Now, Equiano was himself of West African background who had been enslaved and then was able to get his freedom. And one of the things he did was he wrote his memoirs. And these memoirs are entitled The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano. Probably sold much better than The Boring Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano. But what he did, it's partly a memoir of his experiences, but it's also a story of his Christian conversion. And in his book, it's very clear that his opposition to the slave trade isn't just as a basis of what happened to him personally, but is also clearly from his Christian convictions. This book sold like hotcakes. It sold many, many copies, not only in Britain, but in other countries as well. This became one of the hot books to read in the later part of the 1700s. Now, moving on to the Slave Trade Act of 1788. So we're still in the 1780s. The American War of Independence is done. That distraction's out of the way. We've had the Zong case. People are ginned up. There's a society leading the effort, and it actually leads to some further legal developments. It's not just Mansfield in the court handing down court decisions. We actually have Parliament getting involved. And this led to the Slave Trade Act of 1788. Now, this was the first law regulating the slave trade. And what it did was it placed a limit on the number of slaves per ship. Because remember, in the Zong case, the ship owners argued that there were too many slaves on board, things got difficult, so we had to get rid of slaves. So in order to clamp down on that, Parliament said, well, there's a maximum number of slaves you can have on board ship. Now, during the debates about passing this act, we had the Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister at the time, William Pitt the Younger, say against the slave trade that, quote, the trade, as the petitioners proposed to carry it on, so meaning those people who do the slave trade, without any regulation is contrary to every humane, every Christian principle, to every sentiment that ought to inspire the breast of man. So, you have the Prime Minister standing in Parliament speaking against the slave trade and invoking various things, but one of them was Christian principles. Interesting times indeed. Clearly the dial is being moved. Now, later on, a few years later, in 1791, Parliament further prohibits insurance companies from reimbursing ship owners when slaves are thrown overboard. So Parliament, again responding to the Zong massacre, saying that if you throw your slaves overboard, you're not going to get an insurance payout. Also in 1791, we have William Wilberforce. Now, he was able to introduce a bill to Parliament to abolish the slave trade. This was the first bill introduced to Parliament to abolish the slave trade. It went down to defeat by a vote of 163 against to 88 for. So it was about a 2-to-1 margin that it lost, but that's fairly good at that time. Now, Wilberforce is a really interesting figure because he came to Christianity in his adulthood, his early adulthood, but still his adulthood, and he referred to it as his great change. And as a result of this great change of becoming a born-again Christian in his 20s, he said that God had given him 2 great objects. The first of which was the abolition of the slave trade, and the second was the reformation of manners, which for Wilberforce was a very catch-all thing, included welfare treatment for the poor, the elderly, animals, issues of alcohol consumption. It was very broad. But what you have there is he singled out as his first great object the abolition of the slave trade. So it's 1791. Things are going along pretty well, and then disaster. What should happen? But the French should stick their heads up and cause trouble. Because in 1792, this is the year following the Wilberforce introducing his bill into Parliament, the French get rid of their king. And not just in a polite way, they execute him. They behead him. This is Louis XVI. He's gone. Now, the rest of Europe didn't take too fondly to this, given that they all had monarchs as well. And this is what sparked the French Revolutionary Wars, which then, in the 1800s, became the Napoleonic Wars, when Napoleon took over France. So what we have here is a situation of the steam is building. We're getting up ahead of steam. The slave trade is under pressure, it's going down, it's only a matter of time, and then public opinion gets shifted to another matter because war on the continent breaks out and Britain can't be on the sidelines. It has to get involved. And this leads to one of the main arguments in favor of keeping the slave trade, which is that if Britain were to give up the slave trade, then the French, our enemies, would step in and take all the spoils. So again, we have money and worldly matters getting in the way. But the movement was still going on. The committee was still out there doing stuff, and they were under a lot of pressure. Support had dropped away, but they were still at it. So what do? A lawyer saves the day. William Wilberforce had a brother-in-law who was named James Stephen. Now, Stephen looked at what was going on with the war against France, and he realized that a lot of shipping was going on across the Atlantic, and British ships, which were being attacked by French ships, and French ships, which were being attacked by British ships, tended to sail under the flags of neutral countries. So what James Stephen proposed was that the laws which allowed privateers, now privateers are just that, they're private companies or individuals who have ships, and during times of war they can be given what's called a letter of marque, which allows them to go out and attack enemy shipping, and if they capture the ship, it can be theirs, with usually the government getting a percentage. So it's a system designed to almost take on maritime, seatime mercenaries. Stephen realized that if we take these laws and expand them to include neutral shipping, then the industry that would be hardest hit by this would be the slave trade. So in 1787, he working with others in Parliament and Wilberforce are able to get this law enacted, and neutral shipping, where most of the slave trade was now going on, because the slave ships were trying to get away from the conflict between Britain and France, they were now fair game. And this, in a very short period of time, decimated the slave trade. So much so that it was in the same year that the Slave Trade Act was brought about. And this ended British involvement in the slave trade. It was now illegal for the Brits to engage in slave trade. But the war against the French continued until 1814, until Napoleon came back in 1815, and then was gotten rid of again for a second time. But what you had was the British had clearly become against the slave trade. They had taken on a hue of abolitionism. So then when it came to ending the wars against the French, we have the British pushing for abolitionism onto the continent. Because there were three main treaties which ended the Napoleonic Wars in 1814 and 1815. These were the first Peace of Paris in 1814, and then the following year in 1815 you had the second Peace of Paris, and then later on in 1815 you had the final act of the Congress of Vienna. Now, the reason I'm bringing up these treaties is that written into these treaties, on the insistence of the Brits, is some really interesting language, and I'm going to read it to you now. Just some snippets. So in the first Peace of Paris, 1814, it reads, "His Most Christian Majesty," this is the British King, "concurring without reserve in the sentiments of His Britannic Majesty with respect to a description of traffic repugnant to the principles of natural justice of the enlightened age in which we live, engages to unite all his efforts to those of His Britannic Majesty at the approaching Congress, to induce all the powers of Christendom to decree the abolition of the slave trade, so that the said trade shall cease universally." Interesting. So then in the second Peace of Paris, it reads, "Without loss of time, find the most effective measures for the entire and definitive abolition of a commerce so odious and so strongly condemned by the laws of religion and of nature." Then, at the Congress of Vienna, the final act reads, That by a separate article of the late Treaty of Paris, Great Britain and France engaged to unite their efforts at the Congress of Vienna to induce all the powers of Christendom to proclaim the universal and definitive abolition of the slave trade. So what we have here in these three war-ending documents are the British saying abolitionism is bad, it needs to stop, we want the Europeans to get on board with that, and that is partly the basis for ending these long series of wars that have gone on for the last 20 plus years. It's pretty big stuff. But things kept going on a global scale. In 1823, the anti-slavers found the Anti-Slavery Society. This was now designed to end slavery throughout the wider British Empire. They had been successful in ending slavery in Britain itself. They had been successful in ending the slave trade. Now they're going to go to the overseas colonies and protectorates and end slavery there. So then, in 1833, they were successful in getting the Slavery Abolition Act passed, which ended slavery throughout the British Empire, with the exception of India, partly because of the weird legalities of British control of India due to the British East India Company, and then also because it was such a huge country, the British deemed it was somewhat hard to affect things there. But then we have, in 1839, the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society come about. So this was now a society designed not just for Britons to be involved, but also for people of other countries. And this is interesting because this organization eventually changed its name to the Anti-Slavery International, which is widely regarded as the world's oldest international human rights organization. And what did they do in 1844? They held their first World Anti-Slavery Convention. And who was their keynote speaker? Thomas Clarkson, the Anglican minister and abolitionist who back in the 1788s was one of the founding members of the Committee for the Abolition of Slavery. Now, Clarkson, if we want to get a sense of who he is, has a really interesting quote. As it reads, "We cannot suppose, therefore, that God has made an order of beings which such mental qualities and powers for the sole purpose of being used as beasts or instruments of labor." So to Clarkson, it was pretty clear God wouldn't have made different types of people with such amazing abilities for a group of them simply to be used as animal labor for the benefit of another group. And for Clarkson, that was self-evident and reflected the will of God and God's design. So that's pretty profound stuff. So we have here the British abolitionist movement going from being a small group of people, essentially isolated Quakers, to then expanding out to Anglican ministers who were able to influence the political and legal process, and it spread throughout wider society. We had the abolition of slavery in Britain itself, the abolition of British slave trade, the abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire, and then we have the Brits using abolitionism as a basis for ending major wars and promoting abolitionism throughout the world. And all of this occurred depending on where you want to start, but if you take the Somerset case in 1772 and then the World Congress in 1840, you're looking at a 68-year period. That's a pretty huge sea change, given that slavery has been one of the longest, most enduring institutions throughout the world for human history. And this leads to this interesting conclusion, which we now enter into, part 3, the conclusion. We're almost done. You have Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a French political theorist. His most famous work was Democracy in America. written in the 1840s. But de Tocqueville, in speaking about the British abolitionist movement, wrote, "Something absolutely without precedent in history. If you pore over the histories of all peoples, I doubt that you will find anything more extraordinary." It's pretty clear from New Testament passages that I brought up earlier that the Bible clearly did have a major impact on the anti-slavery movement in Britain. It's clear from those passages that those New Testament writings take a pretty harsh view on slavery, and it's not a good thing. The key figures in the British abolitionist movement were committed Christians who again and again cited their Christian beliefs as the motivating factor for the abolitionist movement, and that never went away. It was not a case of a few people got the ball rolling and then it got hijacked. No, the British abolitionist movement was Christian in beginning, Christian in middle, and Christian certainly by the end of this time period that I'm looking at. But I mean, it's like I said, anti-slavery international is still there, and its Christian origins were just immense. Now, what does all this mean in sum? It's pretty clear that the history of humanity is a history of the harm that people inflict on others and ourselves. And much of this has been in the form of slavery. So, for me, I think that we have to look at what Jesus said. In all of the Gospels, there's this recurring invocation of the greatest commandment, which says that we should love God and that we should love others. And I think that this is also applicable to slavery, that there's been a lot of harm done to a lot of people for a long time, but that the way that we can begin to make things better to each other and to ourselves is to place Christ and his salvation work at the heart of it, and that we should thank him for his amazing grace. Thank you all.